Imagine four ruthless bullies cornering a skinny, defenseless boy in an empty chemistry lab, heating a metal spoon over a roaring Bunsen burner until it glows red hot, planning to scar him for life as their twisted idea of entertainment. What they didn't know was that this quiet kid harbored a deadly secret that would turn their sadistic game into their worst nightmare. In the next few minutes, you'll witness one of the most explosive reversals of power ever caught on camera, a tale so shocking it'll leave your heart pounding and your faith in justice restored. This isn't just a story about bullying. It's about the moment when a predator realizes they've cornered the wrong prey. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. Marcus Thompson was the kind of kid who seemed to disappear into the background of Riverside High School, like smoke. At 17, he possessed the remarkable ability to become nearly invisible despite his tall, lanky frame. His dark hair perpetually fell across thick-rimmed glasses that he'd push up his nose with a nervous habit that had become as much a part of him as breathing. The oversized gray hoodies he wore daily seemed to swallow his thin shoulders, making him appear even smaller than his already slight build suggested. Cedar Falls, Michigan was one of those towns caught between two worlds, the old industrial backbone where fathers worked the automotive plants, and the newer suburban developments where lawyers and doctors built McMansions with 3-car garages. Riverside High reflected this divide perfectly, creating a social ecosystem where your zip code determined your place in the pecking order more than any talent or character ever could. Marcus lived on the wrong side of that divide. His mother, Linda Thompson, worked double shifts as a registered nurse at Cedar Falls General Hospital, her scrubs perpetually smelling of antiseptic and exhaustion. Their small 2-bedroom apartment in the Riverside Gardens complex was clean but sparse, with hand-me-down furniture and a refrigerator covered in honor roll certificates that represented Marcus's ticket out of their circumstances, every strata. Report card was another step toward the academic scholarship that would change everything. In the hallways of Riverside High, Marcus moved like a ghost. He'd perfected the art of navigation, knowing exactly which routes to take between classes. To avoid the popular kids' territories, which bathroom stalls were safe, and most importantly, when to make himself scarce. His lunch periods were spent in the library, hunched over advanced calculus textbooks or programming manuals, while other kids socialized in the cafeteria's tribal battleground. The other students barely acknowledged his existence. To them, he was just another faceless academic drone, the kind of kid who'd grow up to fix their computers or do their taxes. Teachers appreciated his consistent performance, but found him forgettable, polite, punctual, and practically mute unless called upon directly. Even then, his responses came in barely audible whispers that required listeners to lean forward to catch his words. But Marcus carried secrets beneath that unremarkable exterior, scars both visible and invisible that told a story no one at Riverside High could imagine. The long sleeves he wore religiously, even on sweltering September days, concealed a roadmap of his past written in faded cuts and poorly healed breaks. His knuckles, though soft now from months of academic focus, still bore the subtle calluses of someone who'd learned to fight not for sport or glory, but for survival. 3 years ago, Marcus Thompson had been someone entirely different. In Detroit's Corktown neighborhood, he'd been known by another name entirely, Ghost. The moniker came from his ability to slip in and out of underground fighting circles like a phantom, taking on opponents twice his size and walking away with enough cash to keep his family's lights on and food on their table. His father, James Thompson, had been a small-time mechanic with big-time gambling debts, and when the loan sharks came calling, teenage Marcus had stepped into the ring to pay what his father couldn't. The underground circuit was a brutal education. No referees, no rules, no mercy. Marcus learned quickly that technique mattered more than size, that speed could overcome strength, and that the will to survive could triumph over almost anything. He studied fighters like textbooks, absorbing their weaknesses, cataloging their tells, developing an almost supernatural ability to read body language and predict attacks before they happened. But that life had ended the night his father died. James Thompson's final words to his son were a desperate plea to leave the violence behind, to use his brilliant mind instead of his scarred fists to build a better future. Marcus had made that promise over his father's hospital bed, and he'd kept it faithfully ever since. The family's move to Cedar Falls was supposed to be a fresh start, a chance for Marcus to become someone new, someone better. His 15-year-old sister Sarah was the only person who knew fragments of their brother's past, though even she didn't understand the full extent of what Marcus had been capable of. Sarah Thompson was everything her brother wasn't: outgoing, confident, popular among her freshman classmates. Where Marcus faded into backgrounds, Sarah commanded attention with her infectious laugh and natural charisma. She was student council, treasurer, JV cheerleader, and somehow managed to navigate high school's social minefield with an ease that baffled her older brother. Yet despite their differences, the Thompson siblings shared an unbreakable bond forged in the crucible of their difficult childhood. Sarah understood that Marcus's quietness wasn't weakness but protection, both for himself and for everyone around him. She'd seen glimpses of what lay beneath his peaceful exterior during their Detroit years, moments when neighborhood predators made the mistake of targeting her, only to find themselves facing a side of Marcus that transformed him into something altogether more dangerous. At Riverside High, Marcus's academic excellence was both blessing and curse. His teachers praised his work, but his stellar grades attracted the wrong kind of attention from students who saw his success as an insult to their own mediocrity. The fact that this nobody from the poor apartments consistently outperformed kids whose parents paid for private tutors and test prep courses was a source of growing resentment among certain circles. The chemistry lab had become Marcus's sanctuary. Mr. David Torres, a soft-spoken teacher in his 50s, allowed dedicated students to use the facility during lunch periods for independent study. Marcus found peace among the precisely organized equipment, the familiar smell of chemical compounds, and the methodical nature of scientific experimentation. It reminded him of the mental discipline he'd learned in fighting, the need for perfect timing, exact measurements, and unwavering focus. On this particular October afternoon, as gray clouds gathered outside the lab windows and the first hints of winter touched the Michigan air, Marcus sat alone at his usual station. His chemistry textbook lay open to a chapter on thermodynamics, but his attention kept drifting to the window where he could see clusters of students enjoying their lunch break in the courtyard below. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Part of him envied their easy camaraderie, their ability to simply exist without constantly calculating angles of escape or assessing potential threats. He pushed his glasses up his nose and returned to his studies, unaware that his peaceful refuge was about to become the stage for a confrontation that would shatter his carefully constructed new identity and force him to confront everything he'd tried to leave behind. The past, Marcus would soon learn, had a way of finding you no matter how far you ran or how completely you tried to bury it. The Bunsen burner at the station next to his flickered with a steady blue flame, its gentle hiss the only sound in the empty laboratory. In a few minutes, that innocent flame would become the instrument of something far more sinister, and Marcus Thompson would discover that some promises are impossible to keep when the people you love are threatened. The ghost of his former self was stirring, and Derek Walsh was about to learn that the quiet kid he'd marked as an easy target was anything but defenseless. Derek Walsh commanded attention the way a storm commands the sky, with an overwhelming presence that made everything else seem small and insignificant by comparison. At 18, he possessed the kind of natural athleticism that college scouts noticed from the bleachers, combined with the sort of cruel intelligence that made him dangerous in ways that went far beyond the football field. Standing 6 feet, 2 inches with the broad shoulders and thick neck of a linebacker, Derek had been blessed with the genetic lottery that turned heads in hallways and made coaches salivate over recruitment possibilities. His sandy blonde hair was always perfectly styled, even after the most brutal practice sessions, and his green eyes held a calculating coldness that his teammates mistook for leadership. The expensive cologne he wore daily, a gift from his father's law firm's Christmas party, announced his presence before he even entered a room. Designer clothes that cost more than most families' monthly grocery budgets hung perfectly on his athletic frame, broadcasting his family's wealth with subtle but unmistakable authority. Derek wasn't just another rich kid playing at being tough. There was something genuinely predatory about the way he moved through Riverside High's social ecosystem, identifying weakness the way a shark detects blood in water. His cruelty wasn't random or impulsive, it was methodical, calculated, designed to establish and maintain the social hierarchy that placed him firmly at the apex of the teenage food chain. The Walsh family name carried significant weight in Cedar Falls. Richard Walsh, Derek's father, was the founding partner of Walsh, Morrison and Associates, the most prestigious law firm in the county. Their firm handled everything from corporate mergers to criminal defense, and Richard's reputation for winning cases regardless of his client's guilt or innocence had made him both wealthy and feared. The Walsh family's colonial mansion on Elm Street stood as a monument to their success, complete with a circular driveway, imported marble foyer, and a garage that housed Richard's collection of luxury vehicles. Derek had grown up understanding that rules were suggestions, that consequences were for people without the right connections, and that power was something you either wielded or submitted to. His mother, Patricia Walsh, had been a debutante from old money who'd married into new money, creating a perfect storm of entitlement that had shaped their son's worldview from birth. Family dinners were lessons in manipulation, where Richard would regale them with stories of how he'd destroyed witnesses, buried evidence, or bought judges with campaign contributions disguised as legitimate donations. At Riverside High, Derek's influence extended far beyond his obvious physical dominance. He'd cultivated a carefully selected inner circle of followers who shared his appetite for cruelty while lacking his intelligence and strategic thinking. These weren't friends in any meaningful sense. They were instruments of his will, each chosen for specific qualities that served his purposes. Kevin Rodriguez, known universally as Kev, served as Derek's primary lieutenant. Despite his Hispanic surname, Kev had grown up in the wealthy suburbs, his father having built a successful construction company that specialized in commercial projects. Kev was shorter than Derek, but built like a concrete block with thick arms, covered in tattoos that his parents had paid expensive laser removal specialists to erase twice already. His role in Derek's hierarchy was simple. He was the enforcer for situations that required more subtlety than Derek's own intimidating presence could provide. Kev possessed a mean streak that bordered on genuine sadism, taking particular pleasure in psychological torture that left no visible marks. He'd perfected techniques like the friendly shoulder squeeze that could bring tears to a victim's eyes without looking like assault to casual observers, or the seemingly playful shove that would send smaller kids sprawling while appearing accidental to any watching adults. His favorite targets were the scholarship kids, the ones whose families couldn't afford lawyers or private schools, the ones who had to endure whatever torment he decided to inflict. Tyler Bennett represented the third generation of his family to attend Riverside High, though his academic performance suggested the family gene pool might be running shallow. Tall and gangly with prematurely thinning hair that he tried to disguise with expensive styling products, Tyler's primary contribution to Derek's crew was his obsession with social media documentation. He filmed everything, From football victories to cafeteria humiliations, building an online presence that celebrated their dominance while carefully editing out anything that might incriminate them later. Tyler's parents had made their fortune in real estate development, and their wealth had purchased their son's acceptance into Derek's inner circle despite his obvious intellectual limitations. He carried the latest iPhone models, professional-grade camera equipment, and editing software that cost more than most families' annual technology budgets. His social media accounts boasted hundreds of thousands of followers who lived vicariously through his posts celebrating the privileged lifestyle of Cedar Falls' elite teenagers. The fourth member of Derek's crew was Josh Murphy, whose family had struck it rich in the dot-com boom before diversifying into cryptocurrency and emerging technologies. Josh was the largest of the group, standing 6 feet 4 inches and weighing nearly 300 pounds of mostly muscle built through years of competitive powerlifting. Unlike the others, Josh rarely spoke, preferring to communicate through intimidating stares and the occasional grunt of agreement with whatever Derek proclaimed. Josh's silence wasn't stupidity. Psychological evaluations that his parents had commissioned during his troubled middle school years had revealed an above-average intelligence paired with profound emotional detachment. He genuinely enjoyed inflicting pain, not from any personal animosity toward his victims, but from a clinical fascination with how much suffering the human body and psyche could endure before breaking completely. His presence in Derek's crew served as the ultimate threat. Everyone at Riverside High understood that crossing Derek might result in a visit from Josh, and nobody wanted to discover what that visit might entail. Together, these four had created a reign of terror that extended throughout Riverside High's student body. Their victims weren't random. Derek possessed enough cunning to avoid targeting kids whose parents wielded real influence or whose disappearance might attract unwanted attention. Instead, they focused on the vulnerable, scholarship students, kids from broken homes, anyone whose family lacked the resources or connections to fight back effectively. Their methods had evolved over years of practice. Physical violence was used sparingly and strategically, always in locations without security cameras and with built-in plausible deniability. More often, they relied on psychological warfare, spreading rumors, orchestrating social humiliation, destroying personal property in ways that couldn't be definitively traced back to them. They understood the threat of violence was often more effective than violence itself, and they'd perfected the art of making their victims complicit in their own torment through fear and shame. The football program provided perfect cover for their activities. Coach Ryan Phillips, a man whose own high school glory days had peaked decades earlier, saw Derek as his ticket to coaching relevance. Derek's athletic abilities were undeniable. He'd broken several school records, attracted interest from Division I colleges, and single-handedly elevated Riverside High's football program from regional embarrassment to state championship contenders. Phillips was willing to overlook almost anything to keep his star player happy and eligible. This protection extended to Derek's crew as well. Kev played defensive end with a viciousness that made opposing teams hesitant to run plays in his direction. Tyler managed the team's social media presence, creating highlight reels that attracted college scouts and boosted the program's profile. Even Josh, despite his size making him too slow for football, served as the team's unofficial enforcer during practices, ensuring that younger players understood their place in the hierarchy. The administration at Riverside High had developed a collective blind spot regarding Derek's activities. Principal Janet Morrison, a career educator in her final years before retirement, had learned to pick her battles carefully. Derek's academic performance, while not exceptional, remained sufficient to maintain his athletic eligibility. His disciplinary record showed only minor infractions, tardiness, dress code violations, the occasional disrespectful comment to a teacher, nothing that would justify derailing the most successful football season in the school's recent history. More importantly, Richard Walsh's law firm represented both the school district and several individual board members in various legal matters. The implicit threat of legal retaliation for any action taken against his son hung over every decision. Like a sword of Damocles, Morrison had seen what happened to administrators who crossed the Walsh family: careers destroyed, reputations ruined, personal lives invaded by private investigators hired to find leverage for lawsuits and character assassination campaigns. Derek understood his position perfectly and exploited it ruthlessly. He'd developed an instinct for identifying the kids who couldn't fight back, the ones whose families lacked the resources or connections to make their suffering matter to anyone. With power, these victims became his entertainment, carefully selected targets for elaborate psychological torture campaigns that could last weeks or months. The selection process was methodical. Derek would study potential victims for days, learning their routines, identifying their vulnerabilities, mapping their social connections. He looked for kids who ate lunch alone, who walked home rather than riding in cars, who wore clothes from discount stores, who showed signs of family dysfunction or economic hardship. Most importantly, he looked for kids who tried to make themselves invisible, because Derek had learned that the ones who worked hardest to avoid attention were usually the ones with the most to lose. Marcus Thompson had been on Derek's radar for months. Everything about the quiet boy triggered Derek's predatory instincts: the second-hand clothes, the defensive body language, the way he flinched when anyone approached too quickly. Derek had done his research, learning about Marcus's family situation, his academic achievements, his complete absence from any social circles that might provide protection. The boy was perfect prey, isolated and vulnerable, with no one who would miss him if he simply disappeared from school entirely. But Derek's interest in Marcus wasn't purely recreational. There was something about the quiet boy that bothered him on a deeper level, something that challenged his fundamental understanding of how the world worked. Marcus's academic performance consistently outpaced Derek's own, despite Derek's expensive tutors and test preparation courses. The boy's obvious intelligence, combined with his refusal to show proper deference to his social superiors, represented a challenge to the natural order that Derek felt compelled to correct. The breaking point had come during their shared advanced chemistry class, where Marcus had inadvertently embarrassed Derek by correctly solving a complex equation that Derek had failed to understand despite his father's hired tutoring. The incident had been minor. Marcus hadn't even realized he was showing up the star athlete, but it had festered in Derek's mind like an infected wound. How dare this nobody, this scholarship kid from the wrong side of town, demonstrate intellectual superiority over someone of Derek's obvious social standing? Derek had spent weeks planning his response, designing a humiliation so complete and devastating that it would serve as a warning to anyone else who might forget their place in Riverside High's carefully maintained hierarchy. The plan was elegant in its cruelty, public, recorded, and designed to destroy not just Marcus's sense of safety, but his entire identity as someone who could succeed through intelligence and hard work. The chemistry lab during lunch period provided the perfect setting. Isolated, equipped with tools that could be weaponized, and sufficiently removed from administrative oversight to allow for extended entertainment without interruption. Derek had tested the timing repeatedly, confirming that Mr. Torres always spent his lunch period in the faculty lounge, grading papers and gossiping with other teachers about their most difficult students. Today would be the culmination of months of planning. Derek's crew had assembled in the hallway outside the chemistry lab, each member understanding their role in the elaborate theater of cruelty that was about to unfold. Tyler had his camera, equipment ready, prepared to document every moment of Marcus's humiliation for posterity and social media distribution. Kev had scouted the area, ensuring that no witnesses or interfering adults would spoil their entertainment. Josh simply stood ready to provide whatever physical persuasion might be necessary to ensure their victims' compliance. Derek felt the familiar thrill of anticipation that always preceded his most elaborate torments. This wasn't just about Marcus Thompson. It was about sending a message to every other scholarship kid, every other nobody who might think that intelligence or hard work could elevate them above their proper station. Today, Derek would remind them all that power came from breeding, from connections, from the ability to inflict consequences without facing any in return. He adjusted his letterman jacket, checked his reflection in the polished metal of the hallway lockers, and smiled with the cold satisfaction of a predator who had cornered perfect prey. Marcus Thompson was about to learn the most important lesson of his high school career, that in Derek Walsh's world, being smart wasn't nearly enough to protect you from being prey. Part 3. The Systematic Oppression. The Campaign Against Marcus. Thompson hadn't begun with grand gestures or dramatic confrontations. Like most effective torture, it had started small, almost imperceptibly, with tiny acts of cruelty that could be dismissed as accidents or misunderstandings by anyone who wasn't paying close attention. Derek Walsh understood that the most devastating attacks came not as single crushing blows, but as relentless erosion that wore down a victim's defenses until they simply accepted their suffering as an inevitable part of existence. It had started in September, during the third week of the school year, when Marcus had made the mistake of answering a question correctly in their shared AP chemistry class. Mr. Torres had posed a complex problem involving molecular bonding that had stumped most of the class, including Derek, who'd been counting on his expensive summer tutoring to give him an advantage in the advanced placement courses that would look impressive on his college applications. Marcus had raised his hand tentatively, his voice barely above a whisper as he'd worked through the solution with methodical precision. His answer had been not just correct, but elegant, demonstrating an intuitive understanding of chemical processes that Derek's hired tutors had failed to instill despite hundreds of dollars in hourly sessions. The moment had lasted perhaps 30 seconds, but it had shattered Derek's assumption that academic success was simply another privilege that money could purchase. The first retaliation had come the following day, disguised as clumsiness. Derek had accidentally bumped into Marcus in the hallway, sending the smaller boy's books flying and scattering his carefully organized homework across the dirty floor. The impact had been calculated, hard enough to hurt, but not hard enough to leave visible bruises that might prompt questions from school administrators. "Watch where you're going, nerd," Derek had said with a grin that didn't reach his eyes, his voice loud enough to attract attention from passing students. Several had stopped to watch as Marcus scrambled to collect his scattered papers, some of which had been trampled by other students who joined in the accident with deliberate footsteps that left muddy prints on weeks of careful work. Marcus had said nothing, just gathered his ruined homework and continued to his next class, his face burning with humiliation, but his expression carefully neutral. Derek had noted this reaction with satisfaction. The boy understood that retaliation would only make things worse, that his best strategy was to endure and hope to be forgotten. Unfortunately for Marcus, Derek had no intention of forgetting. The incidents escalated gradually over the following weeks. Marcus would arrive at his locker to find it jammed with superglue, forcing him to carry all his textbooks between classes until maintenance could repair the mechanism. His lunch would disappear from the cafeteria table when he stepped away to get silverware, leaving him hungry and embarrassed as other students whispered about his family's obvious poverty. His bicycle tires would be mysteriously flat when he tried to ride home, forcing him to walk the 3 miles to his apartment, while Derek and his crew drove past in expensive cars, honking and shouting insults. Each incident was carefully orchestrated to appear random or accidental to casual observers. Derek had studied the patterns of Riverside High's administration and security, learning which hallways had camera coverage and which disciplinary procedures might be triggered by different types of complaints. He understood that school officials were trained to look for obvious bullying, Physical violence, racial slurs, direct threats, but were largely oblivious to more subtle forms of psychological warfare. The beauty of Derek's campaign was its cumulative effect. No single incident was dramatic enough to warrant serious administrative intervention, but together they created a climate of constant stress and humiliation that followed Marcus through his daily routine. The boy's academic performance began to suffer as he struggled to complete assignments with damaged materials and missed classes due to accidental scheduling conflicts that Derek had arranged through his connections with student government. Kev Rodriguez had proven particularly creative in developing new forms of torment that left no evidence of deliberate malice. His specialty was the friendly interaction that concealed genuine cruelty beneath a veneer of casual social contact. He would approach Marcus in crowded hallways with a broad smile and an enthusiastic greeting, then deliver a playful punch to the shoulder that would leave the smaller boy wincing in pain, while appearing to casual observers like nothing more than typical teenage horseplay. "Hey there, Marcus," Kev would say with exaggerated cheerfulness, his voice carrying the artificial warmth of a predator mimicking human emotion. "How's it going, buddy?" The accompanying shoulder punch would be precisely calibrated, hard enough to cause genuine discomfort, but not hard enough to leave a visible bruise that might prompt questions from teachers or school nurses. These interactions served multiple purposes beyond simple physical intimidation. They established Kev's presence in Marcus's daily routine, creating a sense of constant surveillance that made the smaller boy hyper-aware of his surroundings and constantly anxious about the next friendly encounter. They also provided cover for more subtle violations. Kev would use these moments to plant evidence of rule violations in Marcus's backpack, or to whisper threats disguised as casual conversation that would be inaudible to nearby students or faculty. Tyler Bennett's contribution to the campaign involved leveraging his extensive social media presence to orchestrate broader humiliation, campaigns that extended far beyond the physical boundaries of Riverside High. He would surreptitiously photograph Marcus during moments of vulnerability, struggling with a heavy backpack, eating lunch alone, walking home in worn-out sneakers, then share these images with carefully crafted captions that invited mockery and ridicule from his hundreds of followers. The photos themselves were never obviously malicious. Tyler was too sophisticated to post anything that would violate platform terms of service or school social media policies. Instead, he would frame Marcus's poverty and isolation as objects of pity or gentle humor, using language that allowed viewers to feel superior while maintaining plausible deniability about the cruelty of their actions. "Look at this dedicated student walking home in the rain," Tyler would caption a photo of Marcus trudging through a downpour because his bicycle had been vandalized again. "Some people really know the value of hard work." The comments that followed would be predictably cruel, mocking Marcus's appearance, speculating about his family's financial situation, and generally treating his suffering as entertainment for their social media consumption. These posts served to expand the circle of Marcus's tormentors far beyond Derek's immediate crew. Students who might never have noticed the quiet boy in person became aware of him as a figure of ridicule, someone whose very existence provided them with opportunities to feel superior and sophisticated. The psychological impact was devastating. Marcus began to feel that his humiliation was not just a private struggle, but a public spectacle that hundreds of his peers found amusing. Josh Murphy's role in the campaign was perhaps the most sinister, precisely because it was largely invisible to outside observers. Josh rarely spoke and never directly participated in the obvious acts of harassment, but his presence alone created an atmosphere of menace that amplified the impact of every other form of torture. He would simply appear in Marcus's peripheral vision at strategic moments, lurking near the boy's locker, standing at the edge of groups where Marcus might seek refuge, following at a distance when Marcus walked home alone. Josh's psychological profile, had anyone bothered to investigate it, would have revealed a genuinely dangerous individual whose fascination with others' suffering went far beyond typical teenage cruelty. He kept detailed mental notes about Marcus's reactions to different forms of stress, cataloging which approaches produced the most visible fear and which seemed to cause the most lasting psychological damage. His presence in Derek's crew wasn't just muscle, it was the embodiment of escalation. The promise that whatever Marcus was enduring now could always become much worse. The administration at Riverside High remained willfully blind to the systematic nature of Marcus's torment. Principal Morrison had built her career on avoiding confrontations that might threaten her comfortable path to retirement, and she'd developed a sophisticated ability to rationalize away evidence of problems that would require difficult decisions or challenging conversations with influential parents. When Marcus finally worked up the courage to report some of the incidents to school counselors, his complaints were dismissed as normal teenage social dynamics that would resolve themselves with time and maturity. The guidance counselor, Mrs. Patricia Hughes, had been dealing with similar complaints for decades and had developed a standard response that acknowledged the student's concerns while avoiding any commitment to meaningful action. High school can be a challenging social environment, Mrs. Hughes would say with practiced sympathy, her tone suggesting that Marcus's suffering was simply part of the normal adolescent experience. Have you considered joining some extracurricular activities where you might meet like-minded peers? Sometimes the best way to handle social difficulties is to expand your circle of friends. This response demonstrated a fundamental misunderstanding of the power dynamics at work. Marcus couldn't simply join activities to escape his tormentors. Derek's influence extended into most of the school's social organizations, either through direct participation or through friends and allies who would report any attempt by Marcus to establish independent social connections. The boy was effectively trapped in a closed system where every potential source of support had been compromised or eliminated. The few teachers who noticed Marcus's declining academic performance attributed it to typical senior year stress or possible family problems that were none of their business to investigate. His chemistry teacher, Mr. Torres, had observed the boy's increasing isolation and obvious anxiety, but interpreted these changes as natural shyness rather than the symptoms of systematic psychological abuse. Even when direct evidence of harassment was presented to school officials, the responses were inadequate and often counterproductive. Security camera footage that might have documented some of Derek's crew's activities was routinely deleted after the standard 30-day retention period, often before any formal complaints were filed. Written incident reports were buried in bureaucratic procedures that could take weeks or months to process, by which time the evidence had grown stale and the victims had usually given up pursuing formal remedies. The most insidious aspect of the administration's failure was how it reinforced the very power structures that enabled Derek's behavior. By consistently treating his actions as minor disciplinary matters rather than serious harassment, school officials sent a clear message about whose welfare mattered and whose didn't. Students throughout Riverside High understood that complaints about Derek Walsh and his crew would be met with skepticism, bureaucratic delays, and ultimate inaction, while any retaliation against Derek would be swiftly and severely punished. Marcus's family situation made him particularly vulnerable to this systematic indifference. His mother's work schedule meant she was rarely available during school hours to advocate for her son or attend meetings with administrators. When she did manage to take time off to address her concerns about Marcus's obviously declining mental health, she was met with the same dismissive responses that characterized the school's approach to all complaints about influential students. Linda Thompson lacked the educational background and social connections to navigate Riverside High's bureaucratic maze effectively. She didn't speak the coded language of educational professionals, didn't understand the informal power structures that determined which complaints received serious attention, and couldn't afford to hire advocates or attorneys who might have been able to force meaningful action. More importantly, she was terrified of making her son's situation worse by pushing too hard against a system that clearly protected Derek Walsh and his family. Richard Walsh's reputation for destroying anyone who challenged his interests was well known throughout Cedar Falls, and Linda understood that her family's precarious financial situation made them particularly vulnerable to the kind of legal and economic warfare that wealthy, connected families could wage against perceived enemies. The psychological impact of this systematic oppression extended far beyond the immediate harm of individual incidents. Marcus began to internalize the message that his suffering was acceptable, even deserved, and that seeking help would only make things worse. He developed the hypervigilance and defensive posturing characteristic of trauma victims, constantly scanning his environment for threats and modifying his behavior to avoid triggering further attacks. His academic performance, once his greatest source of pride and hope for the future, began to deteriorate as the constant stress made concentration increasingly difficult. Sleep became elusive as his mind replayed the day's humiliations and anticipated tomorrow's torments. His appetite disappeared, leading to weight loss that made him appear even more vulnerable to predators who interpreted physical weakness as an invitation for further abuse. Perhaps most tragically, Marcus began to lose faith in the very qualities that had once defined his identity and sustained his hopes for the future. His intelligence, which had always been his greatest asset, now seemed to attract negative attention and mark him as a target for resentment. His academic achievements, which had once represented a path to a better life, now felt meaningless in the face of social forces that could destroy him regardless of his intellectual accomplishments. The campaign against Marcus had achieved exactly what Derek had intended: the complete destruction of a perceived threat to the established social order. The quiet boy who had once dared to demonstrate intellectual superiority over his social betters had been systematically broken down until he posed no challenge to anyone's position in the hierarchy. His suffering served as a warning to other scholarship students, other outsiders who might forget their place and aspire to recognition or respect. But Derek's success contained the seeds of his own downfall. His campaign had been so effective, so perfectly calibrated to avoid detection while maximizing psychological damage, that he'd grown overconfident in his ability to control the situation. He'd pushed Marcus to the very edge of what a human being could endure, not realizing that some people, when pushed too far, don't simply break, they transform into something altogether more dangerous. The systematic oppression that had been designed to destroy Marcus Thompson was about to encounter the ghost of his former self, and Derek Walsh was about to learn that some prey, when cornered completely, reveals itself to be an entirely different kind of predator. Part 4. The Pattern of Abuse. The October afternoon when everything changed had begun like countless others in Marcus Thompson's carefully orchestrated nightmare. The gray Michigan sky hung low and threatening, pregnant with the kind of cold rain that would make his walk home miserable if his bicycle remained mysteriously vandalized. He'd arrived at school that morning to find his locker once again jammed with what appeared to be chewing gum, but was probably something far more unpleasant, based on the smell that had made several passing students wrinkle their noses in disgust. His first period, Advanced Placement History, class had provided a brief respite from the constant anxiety that had become his normal state of existence. Mrs. Jennifer Adams was one of the few teachers at Riverside High who seemed genuinely committed to education rather than simply managing behavior until retirement, and her classroom felt like neutral territory where intellectual merit still mattered more than social status or family connections. But even that sanctuary had been compromised by Derek's systematic campaign. Marcus had worked for weeks on a research paper about the economic factors that led to the Great Depression, drawing parallels between historical wealth inequality and contemporary social dynamics. The paper represented some of his finest academic work, the kind of sophisticated analysis that had once filled him with pride and hope for his future prospects. He'd arrived at class to discover that his carefully researched paper had been accidentally soaked when someone had spilled a large coffee across his desk just moments before he'd arrived. The damage was clearly deliberate. The coffee had been poured in a pattern that destroyed his work while leaving everything else on the desk completely dry. Other students had watched with varying degrees of amusement and sympathy as Marcus tried desperately to salvage weeks of research from pages that were dissolving into brown mush. Mrs. Adams had been appropriately sympathetic, offering him extension on the assignment deadline and suggesting that he might be able to reconstruct his work from backup files or research notes. But Marcus knew that his home computer was an ancient machine that barely functioned, and his research had been conducted primarily at the school library using printed sources that would take weeks to relocate and re-examine. The incident had been perfectly timed and executed, demonstrating the level of planning and coordination that Derek brought to his psychological warfare campaigns. Someone had been watching Marcus's routine closely enough to know exactly when he arrived at first period, and had positioned themselves to destroy his work at the precise moment when it would cause maximum damage while appearing to be a simple accident. During lunch period, Marcus had retreated to his usual refuge in the chemistry lab, hoping to find some peace among the familiar equipment and methodical processes that reminded him of better times when knowledge and hard work still seemed like viable paths to a better future. Mr. Torres had given him permission to use the lab during lunch for independent study, and the quiet space had become essential to his daily survival strategy. He'd been working through practice problems in his advanced chemistry textbook, trying to concentrate despite the growing knot of anxiety in his stomach that had become his constant companion over the past several weeks. His sister Sarah had started asking questions about his obvious distress, and Marcus knew that he needed to find a way to handle his situation before she became involved in something that could put her in danger. The laboratory was equipped with all the standard high school chemistry apparatus: Bunsen burners, beakers, test tubes, and various chemical solutions that Mr. Torres used for classroom demonstrations. The familiar smell of chemical compounds and the precise organization of scientific equipment provided a temporary sense of order and control that was otherwise absent from Marcus's daily experience. He'd been so focused on his work that he'd almost missed the sound of voices in the hallway outside the lab. Derek's voice was unmistakable, loud, confident, carrying the tone of someone who'd never faced meaningful consequences for his actions. The other voices belonged to his usual crew, their conversation peppered with crude jokes and casual cruelty that made Marcus's stomach clench with familiar dread. "Perfect timing," Derek was saying, his voice carrying clearly through the lab's thin walls. "Torres is in the faculty lounge gossiping with the other losers. We've got at least 30 minutes before anyone comes looking." Marcus felt his blood turn to ice as he realized that he'd been found in what he'd thought was his safe haven. The chemistry lab during lunch period was supposed to be his sanctuary, the one place where Derek's influence couldn't reach him. The discovery that even this refuge had been compromised felt like a physical blow that left him struggling to breathe. He considered his options quickly, his mind racing through possibilities for escape or concealment. The lab had only one entrance, and Derek's crew was clearly positioned to block any attempt to leave. The windows were too high and too small to provide a viable exit route, and the emergency phone was located near the door where Derek's group would certainly intercept any attempt to call for help. His hands were shaking as he tried to continue working, hoping desperately that the group would lose interest and move on to other entertainment. But he could hear their footsteps approaching the lab door, accompanied by whispered conversations that made it clear this wasn't a random encounter. They had come looking for him specifically, and they had a plan. "Remember," Derek was saying, his voice taking on the tone of a military commander briefing his troops, "Tyler gets everything on video. We need documentation, that shows he started. The trouble, that we were just defending ourselves. Kev, you handle the setup. Josh, you know what to do if he tries to run. The door to the chemistry lab opened with a soft click, and Marcus felt his world contract to a single point of terror. As Derek Walsh stepped into the room, followed by his crew, the fluorescent lights seemed to flicker with anticipation, cast in harsh shadows across the laboratory equipment that had once felt friendly and familiar, but now appeared sinister and threatening. Derek's smile was the kind that predators wore when they'd finally cornered their prey after a long and satisfying hunt. His expensive clothes and perfect hair seemed obscene in the sterile laboratory environment, like a cancer that had metastasized into healthy tissue. Behind him, his crew arranged themselves with practiced efficiency, blocking all possible escape routes while maintaining positions that would appear casual to any outside observer who might happen to interrupt their activities. "Well, well," Derek said, his voice carrying a mock surprise that fooled no one. "Look what we have here. It's our favorite scholarship student, hard at work in his little laboratory. How precious." Marcus forced himself to look up from his textbook, meeting Derek's eyes with what he hoped appeared to be calm indifference rather than the terror that was threatening to overwhelm his carefully maintained composure. He'd learned over the past several weeks that showing fear only encouraged Derek's cruelty, while maintaining dignity sometimes shortened the duration of these encounters. "I'm just studying," Marcus said quietly, his voice steady despite the adrenaline that was making his hands shake. "I'm not bothering anyone." Derek laughed, a sound like breaking glass that seemed to echo off the laboratory's tile walls. "Not bothering anyone? Marcus, my friend, your very existence bothers me. You see, you've been showing off in chemistry class, making the rest of us look bad with your little displays of intellectual superiority. That's very inconsiderate." Kev moved closer to Marcus's workstation, his bulk casting a shadow across the textbook that Marcus had been trying to read. The smaller boy could smell the expensive cologne that Derek's crew wore, a scent that had become associated in his mind with humiliation and pain. Tyler was positioning himself with his phone camera, finding angles that would capture whatever was about to happen while maintaining plausible deniability about its deliberate nature. "You know what I think?" Derek continued, his voice taking on a conversational tone that was somehow more threatening than outright aggression. "I think you need to learn some humility. I think you need to understand your place in the social order around here. And I think we're going to help you learn that lesson." Josh Murphy moved to block the laboratory door completely, his massive frame filling the doorway in a way that made escape impossible without a direct confrontation that Marcus knew he couldn't win. The silent threat that Josh represented had been growing stronger over the past several weeks, and Marcus understood that today might be the day when that threat finally became reality. "What do you want?" Marcus asked, though he already knew that the question was meaningless. Derek didn't want anything that Marcus could give him. Derek wanted to inflict suffering for its own sake, to reassert dominance over someone who had inadvertently challenged his position in the school's hierarchy. Derek's smile widened, revealing teeth that were perfect and white, and somehow reminded Marcus of a shark preparing to feed. "I want you to understand something very important, Marcus. I want you to understand that being smart isn't the same as being important. I want you to understand that all your academic achievements don't mean anything if you can't protect yourself from people like me." The Bunsen burner at the workstation next to Marcus's was already lit, its blue flame dancing with innocent cheerfulness that seemed to mock the growing tension in the room. Derek noticed the flame, and his smile became something genuinely terrifying, the expression of someone who had just discovered the perfect tool for the lesson he intended to teach. "Kev," Derek said softly, his voice carrying an undercurrent of excitement that made Marcus's blood run cold. "Light another burner. Get it nice and hot. I think our friend Marcus needs a permanent reminder of today's lesson." The metallic spoon that Kev pulled from his pocket gleamed under the laboratory's fluorescent lights, its surface reflecting the blue flames that were about to transform it into an instrument of torture. Marcus realized with growing horror that this wasn't going to be another session of psychological torment or casual physical intimidation. Derek had escalated beyond anything they'd done before, crossing a line into territory that would leave permanent scars. "Please," Marcus whispered, the word escaping his lips before he could stop it. "Please don't do this." Derek's laughter filled the laboratory like poison gas, toxic and suffocating. "Oh, but Marcus, this is exactly what we're going to do. And when we're finished, every time you look at the mark we're going to leave, you'll remember this moment. You'll remember that being smart didn't save you. You'll remember that you're nothing but prey, and we're the predators." The spoon was beginning to glow as Kev held it over the Bunsen burner's flame, the metal gradually changing from dull silver to an ominous orange red that promised unspeakable pain. The sight of that heated metal sent waves of panic through Marcus's nervous system, triggering memories he'd fought desperately to suppress from his years in Detroit's underground fighting circuit. He'd seen what heated metal could do to human flesh, had witnessed the kind of permanent scarring that would mark a person for life. Tyler was recording everything with professional precision, his expensive camera equipment capturing multiple angles of what was about to unfold. The boy had clearly done this before. His movements were smooth and practiced, positioning himself to document the torture while staying far enough away to maintain plausible deniability about his own participation. His social media followers were about to receive content that would generate thousands of views and comments, turning Marcus's agony into entertainment for the digitally connected masses. "You see, Marcus," Derek continued, his voice taking on the tone of a teacher delivering an important lesson, "the problem with people like you is that you think intelligence makes you special. You think that because you can solve equations and write papers, you deserve respect. But respect isn't earned through academic achievement. It's taken through strength, through the willingness to inflict consequences on those who challenge the natural order." The natural order that Derek referenced was the brutal social hierarchy that had governed Riverside High for generations, a system where wealth and athletic ability determined worth, where scholarship students were tolerated only as long as they remained appropriately grateful and submissive. Marcus's crime hadn't been academic excellence itself, but the quiet confidence that came with knowing he was intellectually superior to his tormentors. That confidence, however carefully concealed, represented a threat to the established power structure that required violent correction. Kev tested the spoon's temperature by holding it close to his own face, feeling the radiating heat that would soon be pressed against Marcus's skin. The metal had reached the perfect temperature, hot enough to cause excruciating pain and permanent scarring, but not so hot that it would immediately cauterize the wound or cause the kind of severe burning that might prompt uncomfortable questions from medical professionals. "Where should we put it?" Kev asked with the casual tone of someone discussing lunch plans rather than torture. "Somewhere visible so everyone can see what happens to kids who forget their place." Derek considered the question with theatrical seriousness, his green eyes studying Marcus's face with the detached interest of a scientist examining a laboratory specimen. "The arm, I think. Right here," he said, pointing to the inside of Marcus's left forearm. "Every time he rolls up his sleeves, every time he reaches for something, he'll see our little reminder. And more importantly, everyone else will see it." 2. The location was strategically chosen for maximum psychological impact. The inside of the forearm was sensitive, highly visible, and impossible to hide without wearing long sleeves year-round. The scar would serve as a permanent advertisement of Marcus's victimization, a mark that would identify him as someone who had been broken by superior forces and serve as a warning to other potential victims about the consequences of challenging Derek's authority. Josh Murphy's presence had become even more menacing as the torture session progressed. The massive boy hadn't spoken a word, but his eyes tracked every movement in the laboratory with the focused attention of a predator preparing to strike. His role in this carefully orchestrated cruelty was to ensure that Marcus couldn't escape, couldn't fight back, couldn't do anything but submit to whatever Derek had planned. Marcus's mind was racing through possibilities for escape or resistance, but every option seemed to lead to even greater suffering. The laboratory door was blocked, the windows were too small and too high, and any attempt to fight would only provide Derek with justification for even more brutal retaliation. His only hope was that someone would interrupt the session, another student looking for a quiet place to study, or Mr. Torres returning early from his lunch break. But Derek had planned this encounter with military precision. The timing had been carefully researched, the location scouted for privacy, the participants briefed on their roles and responsibilities. This wasn't an impulsive act of teenage cruelty. It was a calculated campaign of terrorism, designed to destroy Marcus's sense of safety and agency while providing Derek's crew with entertainment and social media content. You know what the beautiful thing about this is? Derek asked, his voice filled with genuine pleasure at Marcus's obvious terror. Even if someone finds out what we did here, nothing will happen to us. My father owns half the judges in this county, and Coach Phillips needs me to win the state championship. You're nobody, Marcus. You're disposable. You could disappear entirely, and the only person who would even notice would be your pathetic single mother. The reference to his mother sent a spike of rage through Marcus's terror, a flash of the violence that he'd worked so hard to suppress over the past 3 years. Derek had crossed a line by threatening his family, venturing into territory that activated defensive instincts that Marcus had promised his dying father he would never use again. But the promise felt increasingly meaningless as the heated spoon grew brighter and Derek's threats became more specific. In fact, Derek continued, clearly enjoying the effect his words were having, maybe we should invite your little sister to watch. Sarah, isn't it? Pretty girl, that sister of yours. I bet she'd learn a lot from seeing what happens to family members who don't show proper respect to their social superiors. The mention of Sarah's name was the moment when Marcus felt something. Fundamental shift inside his chest, a loosening of restraints that he'd maintained through years of disciplined self-control. His father's deathbed promise suddenly seemed less important than protecting the only family he had left, and the ghost of his former identity began to stir with deadly purpose. Kev was moving closer with the glowing spoon, his face flushed with excitement at the prospect of inflicting permanent damage on someone who couldn't fight back. The heated metal cast an orange glow across his features, transforming his expression into something demonic and inhuman. Tyler adjusted his camera angle to capture the moment of contact, while Josh shifted his position to ensure that Marcus couldn't escape the inevitable. Hold him still, Derek commanded, his voice thick with anticipation. I want to see his face when the metal touches his skin. I want to hear him scream. But as Kev reached for Marcus's arm, preparing to pin it in position for the branding, something unexpected happened in the chemistry lab's sterile atmosphere. Marcus didn't flinch away from the approaching torture implement. Instead, he went perfectly still, his body settling into a stance that none of Derek's crew had ever seen before. His breathing became controlled and measured, his eyes losing the fearful uncertainty that had characterized his demeanor for months. Wait, Marcus said quietly, his voice carrying a new quality that made even Josh Murphy pause in his positioning. Before you do this, I need to tell you something. Derek laughed, assuming that Marcus was about to beg for mercy or offer some pathetic bargain in exchange for his safety. What's that, nerd? You want to apologize for thinking you're better than us? You want a promise to keep your mouth shut? In chemistry class from now on? Marcus looked directly into Derek's eyes for the first time since the confrontation had begun, and something in his gaze made the larger boy take an involuntary step backward. The fear and submission that had defined Marcus's expression for months had been replaced by something altogether more dangerous, a cold calculation that suggested he was measuring distances, evaluating threats, and preparing for violence that would shock everyone in the room. "I want to tell you about Detroit," Marcus said softly, his voice carrying the weight of memories that he'd fought to suppress. "I want to tell you about the fights, about the men I put in hospitals, about why my family really moved to Cedar Falls." The temperature in the laboratory seemed to drop several degrees as Marcus spoke, his words carrying implications that Derek's crew couldn't quite process, but somehow understood, represented a fundamental shift in the power dynamics they'd assumed were fixed and unchangeable. The quiet scholarship student they'd been tormenting for months was revealing glimpses of something that didn't fit their understanding of who he was supposed to be. Kev hesitated with the glowing spoon, uncertain whether to proceed with the planned torture or wait to hear what Marcus was saying. Tyler kept his camera rolling, sensing that whatever was happening might be even more dramatic than the branding they'd planned to document. Josh remained in position by the door, but his attention was now focused entirely on Marcus, rather than simply ensuring that the smaller boy couldn't escape. Derek felt a chill of unease that he couldn't quite explain, a predator's instinct warning him that something had changed in ways he didn't understand. But his pride and his audience wouldn't allow him to back down from a confrontation he'd initiated, especially not in front of his crew and Tyler's camera. Whatever Marcus was implying about his past, he was still just one skinny kid facing four larger, stronger opponents in a room with no escape routes. "Detroit?" Derek sneered, forcing confidence back into his voice. "What's that supposed to mean, nerd? You going to tell us about how tough the math competitions were in the inner city?" Marcus smiled for the first time in months, but it wasn't the expression of a victim hoping to placate his tormentors. It was the smile of someone who had just made a decision that would change everything. Someone who had finally stopped running from a past that had shaped him into something far more dangerous than anyone at Riverside High could imagine. "No," Marcus said quietly, his voice carrying the promise of violence that was about to transform the chemistry lab from a place of learning into a battlefield. "I'm going to tell you about the underground fighting circuit, about why they called me Ghost, and about what happens to bullies who threaten my family." The heating spoon in Kev's hand suddenly seemed less like a weapon and more like evidence of their own stupidity, a tool they'd brought to torture someone who had just revealed himself to be far more dangerous than they'd ever imagined. Derek's campaign of systematic oppression was about to encounter the reality of what Marcus Thompson had been before he'd become the quiet scholarship student they'd thought they could break without consequences. Part 4. The pattern of abuse intensifies. The laboratory fell silent except for the soft hissing of the Bunsen burner flames and the barely audible whir of Tyler's camera equipment. Derek's crew exchanged uncertain glances, processing Marcus's words while trying to maintain their positions of dominance in a situation that had suddenly become unpredictable. The confidence that had characterized their every interaction with Marcus over the past several months was beginning to crack as they realized that their victim might not be as helpless as they'd assumed. Derek felt the first stirrings of genuine unease, but his pride and his reputation demanded that he maintain control of the situation. He'd built his entire identity around being the apex predator of Riverside High's social ecosystem, and any sign of weakness or uncertainty would undermine the fear-based respect that he'd cultivated so carefully. His father had taught him that showing doubt was the first step toward losing power, and Richard Walsh's son wasn't about to display vulnerability in front of subordinates and recording equipment. "Ghost?" Derek laughed, but the sound carried a forced quality that suggested he was working harder to maintain his confidence than usual. "What kind of ridiculous street name is that? You expect us to believe that you were some kind of tough guy back in Detroit? Look at yourself, Marcus. You're a walking scarecrow who probably gets winded climbing stairs." Kev shifted his grip on the heated spoon, the metal now glowing bright orange and radiating waves of heat that distorted the air around it. The implement had reached optimal temperature for inflicting maximum pain and permanent scarring. But something about Marcus's sudden transformation had made him hesitant to complete the branding they'd planned. The smaller boy's posture had changed in subtle but unmistakable ways. His weight was now distributed differently. His hands had assumed positions that suggested readiness for violence, and his eyes had acquired a focus that made experienced fighters nervous. "You know what I think?" Derek continued, his voice rising slightly as he tried to reassert psychological dominance over a situation that was slipping away from his control. "I think you're trying to scare us with some pathetic fantasy about being a tough guy. I think you're so desperate to avoid what's coming that you're making up stories about a past that never happened." Tyler continued recording, but his positioning had shifted subtly as his cameraman's instincts detected drama that might be more compelling than the simple torture session they'd planned to document. His expensive equipment was capturing micro-expressions and body language changes that suggested the power dynamics in the laboratory were more complex than anyone had anticipated. His social media followers were about to witness something that would generate far more engagement than another routine bullying video. Josh Murphy remained stationed by the door, but his attention was now entirely focused on Marcus rather than simply preventing escape. The massive boy's experience with violence was limited to intimidation and the occasional one-sided beating of much smaller opponents, but he possessed enough street sense to recognize when someone carried the kind of dangerous potential that could make size and strength advantages irrelevant. Marcus took a slow, deep breath, his ribs expanding in a way that suggested trained breathing techniques rather than simple anxiety. The transformation that was occurring in his demeanor was subtle but profound. Months of carefully maintained victimhood were being stripped away to reveal something that Derek's crew had never encountered before. The quiet scholarship student was disappearing, replaced by someone whose very presence seemed to alter the laboratory's atmosphere. Detroit's underground fighting circuit operates in abandoned warehouses and empty lots, Marcus said quietly, his voice carrying the authority of someone recounting personal experience rather than fantasy. "The fights are bare-knuckle, no rules, no referees. You fight until someone can't continue, and the winner takes whatever money the crowd was betting. I started when I was 14 because my father owed money to people who would have killed him if I hadn't paid his debts." The specificity of Marcus's description was beginning to penetrate Derek's confidence, introducing details that suggested genuine familiarity with a world that none of Riverside High's privileged students had ever encountered. The casual way he referenced violence and desperation carried the ring of truth that was difficult to dismiss as teenage fantasy or intimidation tactics. "The first fight was against a man named Carlos Mendez," Marcus continued, his eyes focusing on something beyond the laboratory walls. "He was 26 years old, weighed about 190, had been fighting in the circuit for 3 years. Everyone assumed he would destroy the skinny kid who'd shown up to pay his daddy's gambling debts. The fight lasted 18 seconds. Kev's hand was beginning to tremble slightly as he held the glowing spoon, the heated metal becoming increasingly difficult to control as sweat made his grip less secure. The implement was now hot enough to cause serious burns to his own hand if his concentration slipped. But Marcus's story was making it impossible to focus on the simple task of inflicting torture on what they'd assumed was a helpless victim. 18 seconds, Marcus repeated, his voice taking on a dreamy quality as he accessed memories he'd tried to suppress. "Carlos came at me like most big guys do, relying on strength and reach, expecting to overwhelm me before I could establish any kind of defense. He threw a right cross that would have knocked me unconscious if it had connected. But it didn't connect because I wasn't there anymore." Derek found himself leaning forward despite his attempts to maintain dismissive superiority, drawn into a narrative that was revealing aspects of Marcus's identity that challenged everything he thought. He knew about social hierarchies and power dynamics. The idea that this quiet, submissive boy might have a violent past was difficult to reconcile with months of successful intimidation and humiliation. "Speed beats strength," Marcus said, his voice taking on the tone of someone reciting fundamental principles learned through painful experience. "Technique beats size, and the will to survive beats almost everything else." Carlos was stronger than me, had longer reach, more experience with intimidation. But he'd never fought someone who'd been trained since childhood, someone who understood that losing meant his family might be killed. The Bunsen burner flame seemed to flicker in response to the changing atmosphere in the laboratory, casting dancing shadows across Marcus's face that made his features appear older and more dangerous than Derek's crew had ever noticed. The fluorescent lights overhead buzzed with electrical interference that created an almost supernatural ambience around the unfolding confrontation. The underground circuit taught me things that no legitimate martial arts school would ever cover. Marcus continued, his hands beginning to move in subtle ways that suggested muscle memory responding to psychological triggers. How to break bones with minimal force applied to precise locations. How to cause unconsciousness by interrupting blood flow to the brain. How to inflict maximum pain while leaving minimal evidence of what actually happened. Tyler's camera was capturing everything, but the boy behind the equipment was beginning to realize that he might be documenting something far more serious than the routine bullying content his followers expected. The quality of Marcus's voice and the specificity of his knowledge suggested that they were dealing with someone whose potential for violence exceeded anything they'd encountered in their privileged suburban existence. Josh Murphy shifted his weight nervously, his bulk suddenly feeling less like an advantage and more like a liability against an opponent who might possess the kind of specialized knowledge that could neutralize size and strength advantages. The massive boy had relied on intimidation throughout his high school career, rarely encountering anyone willing to challenge his physical dominance. But Marcus's growing confidence suggested someone who had faced far worse threats than teenage bullies. "The name Ghost came from my fighting style," Marcus said, his posture continuing to shift in ways that made him appear larger and more threatening despite his unchanged physical dimensions. "I would be there one moment and gone the next, appearing from angles that opponents couldn't predict or defend against. Fights that should have lasted minutes would end in seconds, with grown men lying unconscious on concrete floors, while a teenager walked away with their betting money." Derek's mouth felt suddenly dry as he processed the implications of what Marcus was revealing. The possibility that their chosen victim might actually be capable of violence was forcing him to recalculate risk assessments that had seemed straightforward just minutes earlier. But his pride and his audience still demanded that he maintain dominance, even as the situation grew increasingly unpredictable. "Even if any of that's true," Derek said, his voice carrying less conviction than before, "that was years ago. You're out of practice, out of shape, probably couldn't fight your way out of a paper bag now. And there are 4 of us and 1 of you in a room with no way out." Marcus smiled again, and this time the expression carried genuine amusement rather than fear or desperation. "You're right about one thing, Derek. There are 4 of you and 1 of me. But you're wrong about everything else. I never stopped training. I just stopped fighting. There's a difference." The heated spoon in Kev's trembling hand had reached the point where holding it was becoming genuinely painful. But setting it down would represent an admission that their planned torture session was no longer feasible. The glowing metal that had seemed like the perfect instrument of intimidation just minutes earlier now felt like evidence of their own stupidity, a weapon they'd brought to a confrontation that was rapidly escalating beyond their ability to control. "Every morning at 5 a.m., I run 5 miles through Cedar Falls," Marcus said, his voice taking on the rhythm of someone who had moved beyond fear into a state of focused preparation. "Every evening, I practice forms in my bedroom, shadowboxing. Combinations that I learned from fighters who would have killed your entire crew without breaking a sweat. I may look out of shape to you, but appearances can be deceiving. The laboratory's atmosphere had transformed completely, shifting from a setting where privileged bullies tortured a helpless victim to something resembling a cage where predators had suddenly discovered that their chosen prey was actually an apex predator in disguise. The change was psychological rather than physical, but its effects were profound enough to alter everyone's understanding of the power dynamics at work. Derek felt the first real stirrings of doubt about the wisdom of their planned torture session. But his reputation and his father's expectations still demanded that he maintain control of the situation. Richard Walsh had raised his son to believe that backing down from confrontations was a sign of weakness that invited further challenges, and Derek couldn't afford to show uncertainty in front of subordinates who might use any sign of weakness against him later. But Marcus Thompson was no longer the quiet scholarship student who had endured months of systematic humiliation without retaliation. The ghost of his former identity was fully awakened now, and Derek Walsh's carefully planned torture session was about to encounter the reality of what happened when genuine predators stopped pretending to be prey. Part 5. The mounting pressure. The tension in the chemistry laboratory had reached a breaking point, where the slightest movement or word could trigger an explosion of violence that would forever change the lives of everyone present. The fluorescent lights overhead seemed to buzz with electrical malevolence, casting harsh shadows that made the familiar equipment appear sinister and threatening. The air itself felt charged with potential energy, like the moment before lightning strikes during a severe thunderstorm. Derek Walsh found himself caught between competing imperatives that were tearing at his carefully constructed identity. His entire sense of self was built around being the dominant predator in Riverside High's social ecosystem, the apex alpha who could intimidate anyone and everyone through superior breeding, connections, and willingness to inflict consequences without facing any in return. But Marcus Thompson's revelations about his past were introducing variables that Derek hadn't planned for, complications that threatened to transform a routine torture session into something genuinely dangerous. The heated spoon in Kev Rodriguez's trembling hand had become a liability rather than an asset. The metal was now glowing bright orange-red, radiating enough heat to cause serious burns to anyone who touched it, but also hot enough to burn Kev's own fingers if his grip slipped even slightly. What had seemed like the perfect instrument for inflicting permanent psychological trauma was now evidence of how badly they'd miscalculated the situation they were attempting to control. Tyler Bennett continued recording with his expensive camera equipment, but his role as documentarian was becoming increasingly problematic as the confrontation escalated beyond the simple bullying content his social media followers expected. The sophisticated editing software and multiple camera angles that he'd planned to use for creating viral content were now potentially capturing evidence of a felony assault that could destroy all their futures if the situation went wrong. Josh Murphy's massive frame still blocked the laboratory door, but his positioning had shifted from confident intimidation to defensive preparation. The huge boy had built his reputation on being an unstoppable force of physical violence, someone whose sheer size and strength made resistance futile for anyone foolish enough to challenge Derek's authority. But Marcus's transformation was activating survival instincts that suggested genuine danger rather than the usual one-sided beatings that Josh was accustomed to delivering. "You want to know why I really stopped fighting?" Marcus asked, his voice carrying a conversational tone that was somehow more threatening than any shouting or bravado would have been. "It wasn't because I lost my edge or got soft from suburban living. It was because I started winning too easily, started hurting people more severely than they deserved for the money they were betting." The specificity of Marcus's statement was chilling in its implications. Derek had expected fear, pleading, maybe desperate bargaining for mercy that would have provided excellent content for Tyler's social media channels. Instead, They were hearing confessions about a capacity for violence that exceeded anything in their experience, delivered with the calm precision of someone describing technical specifications rather than human suffering. "The last fight I took was against a man named Raymond Tucker," Marcus continued, his eyes focusing on memories that seemed to be playing out in real time behind his glasses. Big guy, probably 6'4", 240, looked like he'd been carved out of granite. He'd been fighting in Detroit circuit for almost a decade, had put 17 men in the hospital, 3 in comas. The betting crowd was sure he'd kill the skinny teenager who'd shown up to challenge him. Kev's hand was shaking badly enough now that the glowing spoon was becoming difficult to control, sweat making his grip slippery while the radiated heat was starting to burn his fingers. The implement that was supposed to brand Marcus's arm was now threatening to injure the person holding it, a perfect metaphor for how completely their planned torture session had spiraled beyond their ability to manage. "Raymond came at me like a freight train," Marcus said, his posture continuing to shift in subtle ways that made him appear more dangerous despite his unchanged physical dimensions. 300 pounds of muscle and bone and 20 years of street fighting experience. He threw combinations that would have hospitalized normal people, kicks that could have broken ribs, grappling attempts that should have ended the fight in seconds. Derek felt his confidence continuing to erode as Marcus's story revealed depths of violence and capability that challenged every assumption about social hierarchies and power dynamics that had governed his entire worldview. The idea that this quiet, submissive scholarship student might actually be capable of backing up his implied threats was forcing Derek to recalculate risk assessments in ways that his privileged upbringing hadn't prepared him for. "The fight lasted 93 seconds, Marcus said, his voice taking on the mechanical precision of someone reciting technical data. "Raymond managed to land exactly 2 punches, both glancing blows that I absorbed while positioning myself for counterattacks. When it was over, he had a shattered orbital bone, 3 broken ribs, a dislocated shoulder, and a concussion that kept him unconscious for 47 minutes. The laboratory seemed to contract around the 5 boys as Marcus's words hung in the air like toxic gas, poisoning the atmosphere with implications that none of Derek's crew wanted to process fully. The casual way he referenced severe injuries suggested familiarity with violence that went far beyond teenage posturing or intimidation tactics. Tyler's camera was still recording, but the boy operating it was beginning to realize that he might be documenting the prelude to something that would require serious legal representation rather than simple social media content creation. His expensive equipment was capturing micro-expressions and body language, changes that suggested the power dynamics in the laboratory were shifting in ways that could have permanent consequences for everyone involved. That was when I realized I had become something that my father wouldn't have recognized. Marcus continued, his hands beginning to move in ways that suggested muscle memory responding to psychological preparation for violence. I wasn't defending my family anymore. I was enjoying the damage I could inflict on people who threatened me. I was becoming a predator instead of a protector. Josh Murphy shifted his weight again, his bulk now feeling less like an overwhelming advantage and more like a potential liability against someone who might possess the specialized knowledge necessary to neutralize size and strength through technique and speed. The massive boy had never encountered anyone who spoke about violence with the clinical detachment that Marcus was displaying. "So I made a promise to my dying father," Marcus said, his voice taking on a softer quality that somehow made his words more rather than less threatening. "I promised him that I would never fight again unless someone I loved was in genuine danger. I promised him that I would use my intelligence instead of my fists to build a better future." Derek felt a chill of genuine fear as he processed the implications of Marcus's statement. The reference to protecting loved ones was clearly connected to his earlier mention of Sarah, Marcus's younger sister who had become an unwitting factor in this confrontation. Derek's threats against Sarah might have triggered exactly the kind of situation that would release Marcus from his father's deathbed promise. "But you made a mistake today, Derek," Marcus said, his voice returning to the conversational tone that was more terrifying than any shouting would have been. "You threatened my sister. You crossed the line from tormenting me to endangering my family. And that changes everything." The heated spoon finally slipped from Kev's trembling fingers, clattering to the laboratory floor where it continued to glow like a fallen star against the white tile. The sound seemed unnaturally loud in the tense silence, and everyone's eyes followed the trajectory of the metal implement that had been intended to permanently scar Marcus's arm, but had instead become a symbol of how completely they'd lost control of the situation. "You see," Marcus continued, stepping away from his workstation for the first time since the confrontation had begun, "the thing about promises made to dying parents is that they come with exceptions. When someone threatens to hurt the people you love, all bets are off." Derek found himself backing toward the laboratory windows despite his determination to maintain dominance, his body responding to threat assessments that his conscious mind was still trying to process. The quiet scholarship student who had endured months of systematic humiliation was transforming before their eyes into something genuinely dangerous, someone whose potential for violence exceeded anything in their suburban experience. "So here's what's going to happen," Marcus said, his voice carrying the authority of someone who had made an irrevocable decision. "You're going to leave this laboratory right now. You're going to stay away from me and my sister for the rest of the school year. And you're going to pray that I don't decide you represent the kind of threat to my family that requires permanent solutions." The laboratory fell silent except for the soft hissing of the remaining Bunsen burner flames and the barely audible whir of Tyler's recording equipment. Derek's crew stood frozen, processing implications they didn't want to acknowledge while trying to maintain positions of dominance that no longer felt sustainable. But Derek Walsh had been raised by Richard Walsh, a man who had built his career on never backing down from confrontations, regardless of the potential consequences. The idea of retreating from a fight with a scholarship student was unthinkable, even if that student had just revealed himself to be far more dangerous than anyone had imagined. "Or what?" Derek asked, his voice carrying forced bravado despite the fear that was beginning to undermine his confidence. "You'll hurt us? You'll prove that everything I said about you being a violent animal was true? You'll destroy your precious academic future by getting arrested for assault?" Marcus smiled one final time, and this expression carried none of the fear or uncertainty that had characterized his demeanor for months. It was the smile of someone who had tried to avoid violence but had been pushed beyond the boundaries of restraint by people too stupid to recognize genuine danger when they encountered it. "Derek," Marcus said softly, "you're about to learn the difference between a bully and a predator. You're about to discover what happens when someone who's been pretending to be prey decides to stop pretending." The ghost of Marcus Thompson was fully awakened now, and Derek Walsh's campaign of systematic oppression was about to encounter the reality of what happened when genuine predators were cornered by amateurs who had mistaken patience for weakness. The chemistry laboratory was about to become a battleground, and the heated spoon glowing on the floor would be the least dangerous weapon in the room. Derek Walsh's fatal mistake was assuming that Marcus Thompson's warnings were empty threats from a desperate victim rather than genuine promises from a predator who had spent years learning to kill with his bare hands. The chemistry laboratory, which had been designed for peaceful scientific exploration, was about to become the stage for a demonstration of violence that would haunt everyone present for the rest of their lives. The transformation that overcame Marcus was both subtle and profound, like watching a master actor drop one character and assume another with seamless precision. His shoulders settled into a stance that combat veterans would have recognized instantly, balanced, centered, ready to explode into motion in any direction at a moment's notice. His breathing became controlled and rhythmic, each inhalation and exhalation calculated to maximize oxygen flow while maintaining the kind of mental clarity that could mean the difference between life and death in situations where hesitation was fatal. But Derek had been raised in a world where money and connections could solve any problem, where backing down from confrontations was considered weakness that invited further challenges. Richard Walsh had built his legal empire on the principle that superior force and resources could overcome any opposition, and he'd instilled that philosophy in his son from childhood. The idea that a scholarship student from the poor side of town could represent a genuine threat to Derek's physical safety was simply incompatible with everything he'd been taught about how the world worked. "You want to dance, ghost boy?" Derek sneered, his voice carrying the kind of artificial bravado that came from someone who had never faced real consequences for his actions. "Let's see what your street fighting can do against four guys who actually lift weights instead of just reading books." Kev Rodriguez was the first to move, his role as Derek's primary enforcer, demanding that he take point in any physical confrontation. The stocky boy had built his reputation on brutal efficiency in delivering beatdowns to victims who couldn't fight back, and his experience had taught him that overwhelming aggression usually ended conflicts before they could escalate into anything truly dangerous. He launched himself at Marcus with the confidence of someone who had never encountered serious resistance. The attack came in the form of a straight right hand aimed at Marcus's face, thrown with enough force to break bones, and definitely enough to knock the smaller boy unconscious. Kev had used similar punches to hospitalize 3 different students over the past 2 years, always in locations without security cameras and always against victims whose families lacked the resources to pursue legal retaliation. He expected Marcus to crumple like all the others, setting up the kind of one-sided beating that would restore the natural order Derek's crew depended upon. Instead, Marcus simply wasn't there when the punch arrived. The movement was so fluid and economical that observers would later disagree about exactly what they had witnessed. Marcus didn't duck or dodge in any way that suggested panic or desperation. He simply shifted his position with the kind of precise timing that suggested years of training in reading opponents' telegraph signals and responding with perfect efficiency. Kev's punch whistled through empty air where Marcus's head had been a fraction of a second earlier, the momentum carrying the heavier boy forward into a position where he was completely vulnerable to counterattack. Marcus's response was devastatingly simple. As Kev stumbled past him, thrown off balance by his own missed punch, Marcus drove his elbow upward into the underside of Kev's jaw with surgical precision. The impact was calculated to cause maximum disruption with minimal apparent effort. The kind of strike that underground fighters used to end conflicts quickly and efficiently. The sound of the elbow connecting with bone was like a gunshot in the laboratory's confined space, sharp and final in a way that made everyone present understand that the violence escalating around them was far more serious than the routine bullying they were accustomed to witnessing. Kev's eyes rolled back in his head as his nervous system shut down in response to trauma it had never been designed to withstand, and his body collapsed to the tile floor like a marionette whose strings had been cut. Tyler Bennett, who had been recording everything through his expensive camera equipment, found himself frozen by the speed and brutality of what he'd just witnessed. His social media followers were accustomed to content that celebrated the dominance of privileged bullies over helpless victims, not documentation of genuine violence that could result in serious legal consequences for everyone involved. The sophisticated editing software he'd planned to use for creating viral content was now potentially capturing evidence of a felony assault that could destroy his carefully curated online persona. Josh Murphy, whose massive frame had been intended to serve as the ultimate physical threat in Derek's hierarchy, hesitated for the first time in his high school career. The huge boy had built his reputation on intimidating smaller opponents through sheer size and the promise of overwhelming violence. But Marcus's efficient destruction of Kev suggested someone who understood exactly how to neutralize size advantages through superior technique and speed. Derek felt his worldview cracking as he processed what had just happened to his primary enforcer. Kev Rodriguez was supposed to be the muscle that made Derek's threats credible, the violent enforcer who could turn psychological intimidation into physical consequences when necessary. Watching him collapse unconscious after a single precise strike from their intended victim was forcing Derek to confront possibilities that his privileged upbringing hadn't prepared him for. "That was a mistake," Marcus said quietly, his voice carrying the clinical detachment of someone evaluating technical performance rather than celebrating violence. "I gave you a chance to leave. I warned you about what would happen if you forced this confrontation. But you chose to escalate anyway." The unconscious form of Kev Rodriguez, sprawled across the laboratory floor, served as a stark reminder that Marcus's earlier warnings hadn't been empty threats designed to avoid conflict. The boy who had endured months of systematic humiliation without retaliation had revealed himself capable of violence that exceeded anything in Derek's crew's experience, and the demonstration was just beginning. Josh Murphy finally overcame his hesitation and charged across the laboratory like an enraged rhinoceros, his 300-pound frame generating enough momentum to flatten anyone unfortunate enough to be in his path. The massive boy had never encountered an opponent who couldn't be overwhelmed through sheer physical force, and his approach to violence was as subtle as a sledgehammer, pure mass and aggression applied without finesse or strategy. But Marcus had spent years learning to fight men who were bigger, stronger, and more experienced than teenage bullies from suburban high schools. The underground fighting circuit in Detroit attracted genuine predators, men who fought for survival rather than social dominance, opponents who could kill with their bare hands and had done so when circumstances required it. Josh Murphy might be large and intimidating to his classmates, but to someone with Marcus's background, he was simply another oversized amateur whose size made him predictable. Marcus waited until Josh was committed to his charge, letting the larger boy build momentum that would be impossible to redirect or control. At the precise moment when collision seemed inevitable, Marcus dropped low and swept Josh's leading leg with a technique that used the bigger boy's own weight and speed against him. The movement was perfectly timed and executed, turning Josh's confident charge into an uncontrolled crash that sent him sprawling across the laboratory's equipment tables. The impact of Josh's body against the lab equipment created a cacophony of breaking glass and scattered chemicals that filled the air with acrid smoke and dangerous fumes. Beakers shattered, releasing their contents across the floor in a toxic soup that would require hazmat teams to clean up properly. The larger boy's bulk demolished months of carefully organized scientific apparatus, creating chaos that would cost thousands of dollars to repair and replace. But the financial damage was insignificant compared to the physical trauma that Josh had sustained in his uncontrolled collision with the laboratory furniture. His right arm was bent at an angle that clearly indicated a broken bone, and blood was flowing from multiple lacerations where broken glass had penetrated his skin. The massive boy who had served as Derek's ultimate threat was now moaning in pain while trying unsuccessfully to regain his footing on a floor slick with spilled chemicals and his own blood. Tyler Bennett's camera equipment captured every moment of Josh's destruction with high-definition clarity that would have been perfect for social media content if the footage hadn't documented what was clearly a felony assault. The expensive editing software and multiple camera angles that Tyler had planned to use for creating viral entertainment were now recording evidence that could send all of them to prison if the situation continued to escalate beyond their ability to control. Derek found himself backing toward the laboratory windows as he realized that his carefully constructed hierarchy of intimidation was collapsing around him with terrifying speed. 2 of his enforcers were down, one unconscious, and the other seriously injured. And Marcus Thompson was moving between them with the fluid grace of someone who had been designed for violence. The quiet scholarship student who had endured months of systematic humiliation was revealing himself to be the most dangerous person in the room. "This is impossible," Derek whispered, his voice cracking with the strain of processing events that challenged everything he believed about power and dominance. "You're just a nerd. You're supposed to be helpless. This can't be happening." Marcus turned his attention to Derek with the kind of focused intensity that combat veterans recognized as the prelude to serious violence. The transformation that had begun with his warnings about Detroit's underground fighting circuit was now complete. The ghost had awakened, and the quiet scholarship student who had tried to avoid confrontation was gone, replaced by someone whose capacity for violence exceeded anything Derek's privileged existence had prepared him to understand. "The thing about ghosts," Marcus said softly, his voice carrying the promise of pain that was about to become reality, "is that they can become very solid when the situation requires it. And right now, Derek, the situation definitely requires it." Tyler Bennett finally found his voice, though it came out as a terrified squeak that bore no resemblance to the confident persona he projected through his social media channels. "We should go. We should leave right now. This isn't what we planned. This isn't supposed to happen." But Derek Walsh had been raised by a father who had built his legal empire on the principle that backing down from confrontations was weakness. That invited further challenges. Richard Walsh had taught his son that superior breeding and connections could overcome any opposition, that people like Marcus Thompson were inherently inferior and could be controlled through the application of superior force and resources. "I'm not running from a scholarship student," Derek snarled, his voice carrying the desperate bravado of someone whose fundamental understanding of the world was being destroyed by events beyond his comprehension. "I don't care what happened in Detroit. I don't care about your fighting stories. You're still just one person against all of us." Marcus smiled with genuine amusement as he surveyed the laboratory that had become a battlefield littered with Derek's defeated enforcers. Kev Rodriguez remained unconscious on the tile floor, blood pooling beneath his head where it had struck the ground. Josh Murphy was trying unsuccessfully to stand while cradling his obviously broken arm, his massive frame diminished by pain and the growing realization that his size advantage had become meaningless against someone who understood how to neutralize it. "All of you?" Marcus asked, his voice carrying the conversational tone of someone discussing academic theory rather than preparing for violence. "Let's see. Kev is unconscious and probably has a concussion that will require medical attention. Josh has a broken arm and multiple lacerations that need immediate treatment. Tyler is hiding behind his camera equipment, hoping that someone else will handle the situation for him. That leaves just you, Derek, one-on-one. No weapons, no backup. No daddy's lawyers to save you from the consequences of your actions." The chemistry laboratory's atmosphere had transformed completely, shifting from a place of scientific learning to something resembling an arena where predators established dominance through violence. The fluorescent lights overhead flickered, with electrical interference that created harsh shadows across the scattered equipment and injured students, while the lingering smell of spilled chemicals mixed with the metallic scent of blood to create an atmosphere that was both toxic and threatening. Derek felt genuine fear for the first time in his privileged life as he realized that all his advantages had been stripped away, leaving him alone against someone whose capacity for violence far exceeded his own. The money, connections, and social status that had protected him throughout his high school career were meaningless in a situation where survival depended on skills he had never needed to develop. But Richard Walsh's son had been programmed from childhood to view backing down as weakness that would invite further challenges, and Derek's pride wouldn't allow him to surrender in front of witnesses who might spread word of his humiliation throughout Riverside High's social hierarchy. He launched himself at Marcus with the desperate fury of someone whose entire identity was being destroyed by events beyond his control. The attack was clumsy and predictable, driven by desperation rather than skill or strategy. Derek threw wild punches that might have been effective against untrained opponents, but Marcus had spent years learning to fight men whose lives depended on their ability to inflict violence efficiently and survive encounters that would have killed amateurs. Instantly, Marcus stepped inside Derek's wild swing and delivered a precise strike to the larger boy's solar plexus, driving the air from his lungs and paralyzing his diaphragm in a way that made breathing temporarily impossible. As Derek doubled over gasping for air, Marcus followed up with a knee strike to the face that shattered Derek's nose and sent blood cascading down his expensive Letterman jacket. The violence was clinical and efficient, designed to incapacitate rather than inflict unnecessary suffering. Marcus had learned in Detroit's underground circuit that prolonged beatings were inefficient and potentially dangerous, both legally and practically. The goal was to end conflicts quickly and decisively, leaving opponents unable to continue fighting while minimizing the kind of serious injuries that might prompt police investigations or medical complications. Derek collapsed to his knees on the laboratory floor, blood streaming from his broken nose while he struggled to breathe through damaged airways. The star athlete who had terrorized Riverside High student body for years was reduced to a gasping, bleeding wreck who posed no further threat to anyone. His perfectly styled hair was matted with blood, his expensive clothes were torn and stained, and his green eyes held the kind of shocked recognition that came from encountering violence that exceeded anything in his previous experience. "It's over," Marcus said quietly, his voice carrying the authority of someone who had established dominance through superior capability rather than inherited privilege. "The systematic harassment stops now. The threats against my sister stop now. Your reign of terror at this school is finished." Tyler Bennett finally lowered his camera equipment, his hands shaking too badly to maintain steady footage of the carnage that surrounded him. The social media content he had planned to create lay in ruins along with Derek's crew, replaced by evidence of violence that could destroy all their futures if anyone discovered what had really happened in the chemistry laboratory. "What do we do now?" Tyler whispered, his voice barely audible above the moaning of the injured students and the hissing of gas escaping from damaged laboratory equipment. "What happens when people find out about this?" Marcus surveyed the laboratory that had been transformed from a place of learning into a battlefield littered with the consequences of Derek's miscalculations. The heated spoon that had been intended to brand his arm lay cooling on the floor, surrounded by broken glass and spilled chemicals that would require professional cleanup. The sophisticated torture session that Derek had planned to document for posterity had become evidence of his crew's systematic abuse and Marcus's devastating response. "What happens next is very simple," Marcus said, his voice carrying the calm authority of someone who had taken complete control of the situation. "You're going to call 911 and report that there was an accident in the chemistry lab. You're going to explain that some students were horsing around with equipment they didn't understand and got injured when things went wrong. And you're going to hope that I decide your cooperation is sufficient to avoid more permanent solutions to the problem you represent." Derek tried to speak through his damaged nose and throat, but only managed to produce garbled sounds that might have been attempts at negotiation or surrender. The star athlete who had built his identity around dominating others through superior force had discovered what happened when that force encountered someone whose capacity for violence far exceeded his own. "Or," Marcus continued, his voice taking on a harder edge that suggested alternatives nobody in the room wanted to contemplate, "you can try to tell people what really happened here today. You can try to explain how 4 of you cornered one scholarship student planning to torture him with heated metal and ended up getting destroyed by someone you thought was helpless. You can try to convince authorities that the victim was actually the Aggressor in a situation where all the evidence shows you brought weapons and recording equipment to document a planned assault. The implications of Marcus's words sank in as Derek's crew processed the legal realities of their situation. They had initiated the confrontation, brought weapons intended for torture, and documented their own criminal intentions through Tyler's camera equipment. Any investigation would reveal a pattern of systematic harassment and escalation that culminated in a planned assault that had been derailed by their victim's unexpected ability to defend himself. Tyler's expensive camera equipment had captured everything, but the footage would serve as evidence against Derek's crew rather than the viral content they had planned to create. The sophisticated editing software and multiple camera angles that had been intended to document Marcus's humiliation would instead provide prosecutors with detailed evidence of premeditated assault, harassment, and conspiracy charges that could send all of them to prison. "The choice is yours," Marcus said, his voice carrying the finality of someone who had made his last offer of mercy. "Accident or assault, cooperation or consequences. But choose quickly, because Josh needs medical attention, and the longer we wait, the more questions people are going to ask about what really happened here." Derek looked up from the laboratory floor where he knelt bleeding and defeated, his green eyes meeting Marcus's gaze with the desperate recognition of someone whose entire worldview had been shattered by events beyond his comprehension. The social hierarchy that had governed his existence for 18 years had collapsed in a matter of minutes, leaving him powerless and vulnerable in ways his privileged upbringing had never prepared him to handle. "Accident," Derek whispered. Through his damaged throat, the word carrying all the weight of complete surrender. "It was an accident. We were just fooling around and things went wrong." Marcus nodded with satisfaction as he heard the magic words that would transform the chemistry laboratory from a crime scene into the site of an unfortunate mishap that required medical attention rather than police investigation. The ghost of his former identity settled back into dormancy, replaced once again by the quiet scholarship student who wanted nothing more than to complete his education and build a better future for his family. But as Tyler Bennett began dialing 911 with trembling fingers, and Derek's crew contemplated the permanent consequences of their miscalculations, Marcus Thompson understood that some transformations were irreversible. The months of systematic harassment had awakened something that could never again be completely suppressed, and Derek Walsh's campaign of terror had created exactly the kind of dangerous predator that his father's legal philosophy had taught him to fear. The quiet scholarship student who had endured months of humiliation without retaliation was gone forever, replaced by someone who understood that true strength came not from inherited privilege or social connections, but from the willingness and ability to protect the people you loved from anyone foolish enough to threaten them. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.